Welcome, weary traveler. You've left behind the noise of the world and stepped into a realm untouched by time. Here, candlelight dances upon ancient stone walls, and the air carries the soft hum of forgotten lullabies beyond these gates. The night is gentle, and every story is a silver thread, weaving warmth around your heart. So, rest your mind. Let each word be a quiet step into the halls of dreams, until sleep, tender and deep, finds you. You are safe here, and slowly, the world drifts away. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the story drift over you. Chapter 1: The Whispering Healers of the Village Inn. The quiet folds of the medieval countryside, where hills rolled like the backs of sleeping giants and the air carried the scent of earth and woods. There lay a village that did not appear on any grand map. It was neither poor nor prosperous, neither forgotten nor famed. It was simply still, and that stillness had a kind of peace to it, like a page left half-written, waiting for the ink to dry. When the sun sank behind the birch trees, the cottages began to glow with candlelight, and a faint mist rose from the meadows. You might hear the distant clatter of a wooden pail, the muted bleat of a sheep settling for the night, or the faraway toll of a church, but its echo rolling like a sigh through the valley. It was here that people whispered of strange ailments, soft and half-believed, that touched their world in ways the mind could scarcely hold. No one spoke of them loudly. The strange diseases of the age were not like the storms or wars that tore through lands. Those were noisy things, easy to name. These were quieter. They moved like the fog, silent, pale, and patient. The villagers called one of them the sleeping sickness. It would come not with fever or wounds, but with dreams that clung too long. A farmer might lie down to rest after tending his field, only to drift into a slumber that stretched on and on, a sleep so deep it seemed like another kind of life. Yet the faces of those afflicted were peaceful, so serene that some whispered they had simply wandered too far into their dreams and forgotten the way home. And whenever such a strange illness appeared, people would make their way down the narrow earthen path to the healer's cottager place, wrapped in ivy and smoke, with herbs hanging like small green bells above the doorway. Her name was Alwyn, though most called her the Whispering Healer, not because she spoke softly, though she did, but because her voice seemed to blend with the sounds around her, the murmur of the wind, the sigh of the fire, the slow rhythm of the heart itself. She would greet each visitor the same way, whether they came with a wound or a worry. "Sit, my dear, and rest a while." The body mends best when it remembers stillness. Her cottage smelled of sage and beeswax, and on the long wooden table lay bundles of lavender, small glass jars of honey, and strips of linen folded neatly as if waiting for a story to begin. At night, when the wind howled through the forest, the villagers said you could see her candle burning steadily in the window, a sign that she was watching over the dreams of the sick. It was said that Alwyn had once studied in a monastery far to the north, where monks tended gardens of healing plants and copied knowledge into thick parchment books. But the world beyond had been restless diseases, had spread through towns. Nobles had fled to their estates, and the air itself seemed heavy with prayers for mercy. So Alwyn had left the cloisters, trading the echoing halls for the quiet breath of this small valley. And there, she listened. She listened to the rhythm of coughs and sighs, to the songs mothers hummed to restless children, and to the low drone of bees that visited her herbs each morning. She said that the world itself spoke in murmurs, if one knew how to hear them. And when the strange fevers came, or when sleep clung too tightly to the living, she would brew her remedies with a patient calm that steadied even the most anxious hearts. One evening, as twilight pooled along the cobblestones, a young shepherd named Thomas came to her door. He carried his sister in his arms, a girl pale as moonlight, her breath shallow but even. He laid her gently upon the bed near the hearth, and Alwyn placed a hand over the girl's brow. "She's warm," she whispered, "but it is not a fever that burns. Her spirit wanders." Thomas bowed his head. "She fell asleep 3 nights ago and won't wake. We tried prayers, bells, even song, but she only sighs, as if listening to something far away." Alwyn stirred the fire until it glowed deep amber. Then she began to crush dried petals of chamomile and rosehip, their scent drifting like comfort through the room. Outside, the wind brushed against the shutters, carrying the faint cry of an owl. "She dreams too deeply," said the healer. "There are dreams that feed the soul, and dreams that keep it from returning." She poured the mixture into a clay bowl, added warm water, and began to whisper not words of command or magic, but the kind of soft murmuring one uses with a restless child. She called it coaxing the spirit back to wakefulness. Hours passed in that tender silence. The boy watched as the candlelight flickered across his sister's face, and Alwyn's voice floated in steady rhythm, low, melodic, like a lullaby sung backward from sleep into life. And just before dawn, the girl stirred. Her lips parted. She breathed in as though surfacing from a deep pool, and opened her eyes to the amber light. Thomas began to weep quietly, and Alwyn only smiled, brushing the girl's hair from her brow. "The sickness is not always of the body," she said softly. "Sometimes the world beyond dreams is too beautiful to leave. We must remind the soul that there is beauty here, too." Word of her healing spread like warmth through the cold. From distant villages, travelers came seeking her counsel, not just for strange diseases, but for ailments of spirit, for exhaustion, for grief. And though she treated all who came, she asked for no coin. Instead, she only requested that when they left, they light a candle in their window, so the valley would glow with small points of hope on winter nights. In those days, people believed deeply in unseen forces, the humors of the body, the balance of the stars, the moods of the moon. To them, illness was not merely an accident of the flesh, but a conversation between the soul and the world. And so Alwyn listened. She taught that even disease had its quiet reason, that in every fever there was a lesson, in every chill a reminder of what warmth meant in later years. Scholars would write of epidemics, of plagues and pestilences that swept across Europe. But in this little village, time moved differently. Seasons turned gently, and the sicknesses that came were faced not with fear, but with candlelight and kindness. The people did not curse their fates, they whispered to them, and in that whispering found peace. When night fell, the villagers would sometimes gather near the healer's door. They'd bring bread, broth, or small gifts of herbs, and sit quietly while Alwyn told stories. Stories of other times, other lands of the Roman physicians who once mixed wine with honey for healing, of the monks who believed that dreams themselves carried messages of the divine. Her voice would slow with each tale, softening until words became like waves on the edge of sleep. Sometimes, she would speak of the strangeness of life itself, how the body could be frail yet hold such courage, how even disease could be a teacher, and the people would listen, eyes half-lidded, hearts eased, because in her presence, even the idea of sickness seemed gentler, more understandable, more human. There was a peace in not fighting what could not be controlled. There was grace in tending to what could be soothed. And above all, there was comfort in knowing that every ache, every weakness, every faint and fleeting sorrow was part of a greater rhythm, the heartbeat of the world, steady and eternal. That night, as the moon rose and bathed the valley in silver, Alwyn stood by her door. The stars trembled faintly in the sky, their reflections caught in the dewdrops upon the grass. From afar, she could see the faint glow of candles in cottage windows, small flames flickering like a constellation on earth. And in that soft, shimmering quiet, she felt a calm settle deep within her bones. Tomorrow there would be new ailments, new stories, new whispers of the strange diseases that touched human life. But tonight was for stillness, for the slow hum of crickets, for the sigh of the sleeping earth, for the simple peace of knowing that, even in a world of mystery, healing could begin with a whisper. And so the healer closed her door, banked the fire, and let the world drift into dream. Chapter 2: The Pilgrim's Fever. There was a time, in those quiet centuries between plague and peace, when roads wound through the countryside like pale threads, connecting towns and abbeys, villages and shrines. Pilgrims walked those roads with slow devotion, some barefoot, some cloaked, all carrying stories upon their backs. They followed the call of faith, or repentance, or simple wonder, stopping at wayside chapels to rest beneath carved saints and fading. The roads were peaceful by day, lined with heather and larkspur, and yet there was always something otherworldly about them. Travelers spoke of seeing strange lights at dusk, or of feeling a presence walking beside them unseen. Perhaps it was only the weariness of the long journey. Perhaps it was something older, whispering through the land. And along one such road, winding between mossy stones and tall oaks, There came a young man named Corin. He had been walking for weeks, his sandals worn thin, his satchel lightened of nearly everything but hope. He sought the great cathedral by the river, a place said to hold a relic capable of curing the sick. But as he neared the foothills, a fever began to bloom in him, subtle at first, then deep as the sun itself. It was not the violent fever of plague, nor the wasting chill of winter sickness. This was a gentler burning, a warmth that seemed to rise from within, as though his spirit itself were aglow. He felt lightheaded but strangely at peace. The trees shimmered faintly as if brushed with gold. The winds seemed to hum in soft tones. Even the shadows on the road moved as though alive with hidden music. By the time Corin reached a small chapel beside a spring, his strength had waned. He collapsed upon the grass, his hands trembling like leaves. The world around him blurred into color and sound. Yet there was no fear in him, only a sense of being carried, as though his illness were a gentle tide drawing him towards some forgotten shore. Inside the chapel, an old monk tended to the lamp near the altar. His robe was simple linen, worn smooth by years of service, and his eyes were the color of rain. When he saw the pilgrim faint by the doorway, he came quietly, his movements unhurried, his presence calm. He laid a cool cloth upon the young man's brow and whispered a prayer that had no name, only rhythm. When Corin awoke, he found himself lying upon a straw bed, the faint light of candles flickering across the wooden beams above. He could hear the slow drip of water from the spring outside, and the murmur of the monk's voice reading softly from a psalter. "Rest," said the monk, noticing his eyes open. "You have come far. The fever walks with you, but it is not cruel." Corin swallowed, his throat dry. "I feel as though I am aflame," he whispered, "but the fire brings no pain, only visions. I see faces in the light. I hear songs when the wind moves." The monk smiled faintly, dipping the cloth once more into cool water. "There are fevers of the body," he said, "and there are fevers of the soul. Pilgrims often meet both before they reach their journey's end." He explained that this illness was known among travelers, the pilgrim's fever, the monks called it. It was said to strike those who walked too far under the sun, whose hearts were too full of devotion or longing. The fever blurred the line between body and spirit, and though it sometimes brought weakness, it also brought strange peace. In rare moments, those afflicted would speak of hearing distant bells where none had rung, or of seeing light dance where no flame burned. In the monastery records, scribes had noted such cases with care. Some believed the fever was divinest sign that the soul was touched by grace. Others said it was the body's exhaustion, wrapped in the cloth of mystery. But in those candlelit chambers, the truth mattered less than the gentleness with which the sick were tended. And so the days passed in quiet rhythm. Each dawn, the monk would place a bowl of clear water near the window where the morning light could strike it, whispering that light itself was medicine. He would crush mint and angelica, steeping them in honeyed wine, and let the fragrance fill the air. And as Corin lay resting, he would listen to the sounds of the world moving softly beyond the walls, the rustle of doves in the eaves, the sigh of the wind through the pines, the slow toll of the bell that marked each prayer hour. Sometimes In the half-waking moments between sleep and awareness, Corin thought he could see the air shimmer. Shapes would form and fade like dust motes, in sunlight gentle outlines of travelers, barefoot and radiant, walking unseen. He wondered if they were other pilgrims, long past, still journeying in dreams. The thought comforted him. He felt less alone. The monk, whose name was Brother Ansel, would often sit by his side in the evenings, reading softly from old texts. Not sermons, nor strictures, just reflections on the beauty of patience, on the holiness of rest. He told stories of other healers who believed that every illness was a form of transformation, that fever purified, that fatigue humbled, that each trembling breath was a step toward understanding life's quiet fragility. Outside, the autumn deepened. Leaves fell in slow spirals, gathering like embers upon the road. Travelers who passed the chapel would sometimes stop to fill their flasks at the spring, and the monk would bless them before they continued on. They would glance toward the window where the sick pilgrim lay, and whisper prayers for him as they walked away. Corin's fever waxed and waned like the moon. There were nights when his skin grew cool, his thoughts clear, and he spoke softly of the stars he had seen in his dream, stars that sang in colors too gentle for waking ears. And there were nights when the heat returned, when his breath came shallow, and he felt himself drifting beyond the edges of his own body. But always there was peace. Brother Ansel never hurried his recovery, never scolded the illness. He treated it as one might treat a season, something to be lived through, not conquered. The world teaches us to fear what burns, he said one evening, watching the candlelight dance. But even fire is sacred when it warms, when it transforms. Corin began to believe this. He no longer dreaded the fever's touch. He welcomed it like a tide that would one day ebb. In that surrender, his dreams grew tender and luminous. He dreamt of fields of golden grain rippling in the wind, of cathedrals made of light, of rivers that carried whispers instead of water. And through it all, he felt the pulse of the world beating softly beneath him. When at last his fever broke, it did so not with drama, but with silence. He awoke one morning to find the air cool, the breeze sweet. The monk was tending to herbs outside, humming a tune older than words. The pilgrim sat up slowly, his body light, his heart full. He felt as though something had been washed clean inside him, not just sickness, but sorrow. Brother Ansel returned and smiled when he saw the color in Corin's face. "The fever has left you," he said, "but do not rush to walk again. Rest until your spirit and your feet move together." Corin stayed for several more days, helping the monk grind herbs and sweep the small stone floor. They spoke little, for silence was its own prayer. And when the time came to leave, the monk gave him a small vial of water from the spring. "For remembrance," he said, "not of sickness, but of healing. You carry the lesson, now the fever's wisdom." As Corin walked away along the winding road, he looked back only once. The chapel glowed softly in the sun, and a single dove circled above it before vanishing into the trees. He felt no lingering weakness, only gratitude. He understood now what the monk had meant, that illness, too, could be a pilgrimage, that the body, in its fragility, could lead the soul toward peace. And so he continued his journey, not toward the distant cathedral, but toward the quiet within himself. For that was where all pilgrimages ended, in the heart's stillness, where no fever could reach and no road could. Chapter 3. The dancing plague. The summer had come to the valley early that year. The fields shimmered beneath a heat that felt older than the sun itself, and the air carried the scent of ripening grain and distant rainstorms. In the little riverside town of Strasbourg, the cobbled streets were warm underfoot. The bells rang lazily from the cathedral, and life unfolded in its unhurried rhythm. Children played in the shadow of the market square, and bakers wiped the flour from their forearms as they set loaves to cool by open windows. But on one still morning, as the first lights spilled across the square, a woman began to dance. Her name was Frau Trophia. She stepped into the street barefoot, her hair unbound, her eyes half closed, as though she listened to something only she could hear. At first, those who saw her smiled. A bit of midsummer joy, perhaps some song of the heart that needed no lute or drum. But as the sun climbed higher, she did not stop. Her feet moved faster, her breath came in soft gasps, and yet she danced on, as though the earth itself compelled her by noon. The sound of her steps echoed through the streets, a steady rhythm against the stone. Children stopped their games. Traders paused mid-gesture, and still she turned and turned, her movements graceful yet weary, until her limbs trembled from exhaustion. No one knew what to make of it. Some whispered it was a fit of madness, others a punishment from heaven, or a visitation of spirits. But when they tried to hold her still, her body shook with a wild energy, not violent, but unstoppable, as if the dance had claimed her by nightfall. The moon rose pale and curious over the rooftops, and the woman still moved beneath it, swaying in strange, rhythmic silence. Lanterns flickered as the townsfolk gathered, drawn by the soft shuffle of her feet upon the stones. They did not laugh nor mock. They only watched, hearts uneasy yet entranced, for there was something both sorrowful and sacred in the sight of her, something that seemed to belong to another world. When dawn returned, she collapsed where she stood, her breath shallow but calm. The townspeople carried her gently into the shade of a chapel, where nuns laid cool cloths upon her brow. And yet, before the second night had fallen, others began to move as she had. One by one, men and women stepped into the square, their faces serene, their eyes glassy, their bodies caught in the same invisible rhythm. It spread like the echo of a dream. Soon there were dozens of them, then hundreds spinning, stepping, turning in slow unison, as though caught in a music that came from beneath the earth. No pipes played, no tambours beat, only the quiet thud of soles upon the stone and the faint, haunting hum of breath. The priests of the town were bewildered. The magistrates debated in hushed tones, and the people whispered of St. Vitus's dancer, strange affliction said to strike the devout, compelling them to move without rest, sometimes for days. Some believed it was divine, others demonic, others still that it was the mind's way of breaking free from the weight of sorrow that had long pressed upon the land. For life in those years was heavy. Crops had failed in places. Illness had left many thin and weary. And yet, in the midst of all that weariness, the dance came not cruelly, but insistently, like a fever of the heart. The town physician, Master Ergot, stood by the square each evening, his notes trembling in his hand. He had seen fevers, rashes, wounds, and plague, but nothing like this. These people, he murmured to a friar beside him, they move as if released from something unseen. Their faces show no pain, only peace, and yet they are lost to it. The friar, whose robe smelled faintly of frankincense, nodded with quiet awe. Perhaps, he said, they dance for those who no longer can. And perhaps they did. Each night, candles were placed around the square, their flames flickering in the summer breeze. Children watched from the doorways as the dancers spun, the light glancing off their hair like halos. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, wax, and rain. And sometimes, when the night grew deepest, the whole town would fall silent except for that soft, endless rhythm, the sound of tired feet keeping time with something older than memory. No one was harmed. The dancers neither fought nor cried. They moved until their strength was gone, then lay down in the cool grass by the river to rest. And when they awoke, they spoke of nothing terrible only, of feeling lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from their hearts. It was as if, in that strange season, all the sorrow that had lingered unseen in the people had taken shape and risen into motion. Sorrow given wings, sorrow given grace. The city elders sought cures. They brought musicians to match the rhythm, thinking to guide it into harmony. They prayed, burned herbs, blessed the square. But nothing stopped it until, one morning in late August, it simply began to fade. The dancing slowed. The laughter grew quiet. And, like mist dissolving under sunlight, the fever drifted away, leaving behind only a deep, resonant calm. The town felt lighter, as though some long-held grief had been washed clean. And in the silence that followed, there was peace. For years afterward, the people of Strasbourg spoke of that summer in hushed tones, not as a calamity, nor as a miracle, but as something tender and unexplainable, a moment when the world had reminded them of its mystery. Some said the dancers had been caught in divine ecstasy, others that it had been the soul's rebellion against despair. But whatever it was, they did not fear it anymore. They learned, instead, to listen in the evenings. As twilight settled over the river, the elders would tell the story to the young, how once the town had danced for days and nights without end, and how afterward the harvests had been kinder, the winters less cruel. They said the air itself had been cleansed by rhythm, and so, in time, the tale became gentler lullaby of history. The woman who had begun it all, Frau Trophia, was remembered not as a madwoman, but as a messenger of release. Her name was spoken softly, in gratitude, by those who believed she had carried the grief of the town upon her feet, until the earth itself took it back. In later centuries, scholars would write of the phenomenon with curiosity. They would call it mass psychogenic illness or collective trance. They would measure it, categorize it, explain it. But none of those words captured the hush that had fallen over the town when the dancing ceased, the way the air seemed washed clean, the way hearts felt strangely light. For there are moments in history that belong not to reason, but to rest. Moments when humanity sighs and remembers itself. The dancing plague was one such moment of fever that soothed instead of destroyed. A movement that left behind stillness. And even now, if you walk through Strasbourg at night, when the streets are empty and the river hums softly under the bridges, some say you can still hear it. A faint rhythm beneath the stones. A quiet echo of feet that once moved in surrender, not in fear, not in madness, but in peace. The breeze through the linden trees carries it gently, a reminder that even the strangest afflictions can bear gifts, and that sometimes healing begins with a single, unbidden step. And as the moonlight spills over the quiet square, the town seems to breathe again, slow and deep, as though asleep. Chapter 4. The Night Air of Florence. There are nights in Florence when the Arno moves so slowly it seems to dream. The bridges rest upon its surface like folded hands, and lanterns ripple their light upon the water in trembling gold. From distant hills, the cicadas hum in gentle rhythm, and from the narrow lanes rises the faint fragrance of rosemary, candle wax, and bread just taken from the oven. It is a city of artists, scholars, and quiet watchmen, and yet, on certain nights, the air itself feels alive, as though carrying whispers no one can quite name. They call it La Cattiva Aria, the bad air. The miasma, a ghostly presence that slips through shutters and across rooftops, unseen but deeply felt. In the long summers of the 14th and 15th centuries, people spoke of it in low voices, believing it to be the very breath of sickness, the invisible messenger of fever. And though science had not yet found its language, their hearts knew something was amiss in the wind. But Florence, ever proud and curious, did not surrender icily to fear. Instead, it listened. The scholars of the city, those who painted the heavens upon parchment and wrote the anatomy of angels, began to study the movement of the air. They watched how mist pooled along the riverbanks and how it shimmered near the marshes at dusk. They noted how illness came when the nights grew too still, when the heat lingered too long. And in that quiet observation, they began to learn something that could not yet be written, that the world was both delicate and alive. On one such evening, beneath a velvet blue sky, an old physician named Lorenzo walked through the quarter near Santa Croce. His robes brushed the cobblestones softly, and in one hand he carried a small lantern, its glow painting a halo of gold around him. He was known not for his medicines, but for his patience. A man who believed that healing began not in cures, but in calm. Fear, he would tell his apprentices, is the truest contagion of all. He had spent the day tending to the weak and weary, not plague victims, not fevered souls, but those who felt the malaise of summer upon them, the heaviness, the faint ache, the restless dreams. And though he had poultices and potions aplenty, he prescribed most often a simple thing: open the shutters at dawn, breathe the morning air, and walk where the breeze moves freely. This was his quiet rebellion against the belief in poisoned winds. He did not deny the sickness, only its despair. Yet even Lorenzo felt, on certain nights, the strangeness of the air. There were evenings when a fine mist crept in from the river and settled in the low streets. It glowed faintly in the lamplight, curling like silk around doorways. The cats moved more slowly through it. The candles guttered in odd rhythms. And though he told himself it was only the moisture of the summer, something ancient stirred in his heart, a reverence for the mystery of what could not be seen that night. As he crossed the Piazza della Signoria, the city seemed half asleep. The fountains whispered, the statues gleamed in moonlight, and from a high window came the faint sound of a lute being tuned. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of lilies and distant rain. Lorenzo paused beneath an archway and closed his eyes. The world felt suspended, as though holding its breath. From the shadows, a soft voice broke the silence. "You still walk at night, maestro." It was Sophia, the apothecary's daughter. Her basket was half filled with sprigs of lavender and sprouted basil, gathered from her family's garden near the city wall. She was young, but her eyes carried the calm of someone who listened deeply. She had often watched Lorenzo mix tinctures in the courtyard of the hospital, and had learned to recognize the smell of every herb. "Ah, Sophia," Lorenzo said, his voice slow, like a sigh wrapped in warmth. "Sleep will not come to me tonight. The air feels heavy." She nodded, glancing toward the river. "Father says it is the miasma returning. He has hung rue and sage in every window. And does he sleep easier for it?" asked Lorenzo, smiling faintly. Sophia returned the smile, a little sad. "He says it helps, but sometimes I think it is not the air that makes us sick. It is the fear of breathing." They walked together for a while through the narrow streets. The lantern in Lorenzo's hand cast long shadows on the walls, soft and uncertain, like memories. Everywhere, Florentines had placed small bouquets of herbs by their doors, tied with ribbons or rosary cords. The scent of them mixed with the night air, sharp, green, and strangely soothing. In the hospital by the convent wall, the sick lay in quiet rows. Lorenzo had ordered that the windows remain open, though many protested. He believed that illness could not thrive where light and wind were allowed to move. And so, on still nights, he walked from bed to bed, whispering small comforts, wiping brows with cool cloths, murmuring prayers in the softest Latin he knew. "Rest, my children," he would say. "The air is not your enemy. It is your oldest friend." He had come to see sickness not as a punishment, but as a teacher. The world, he thought, was a great body itself, its rivers like veins, its winds like breath, its storms like fever. When the air turned strange, it was the world's way of remembering balance. At dawn, when the sky paled to rose and pearl, Lorenzo would climb the small tower near his dwelling and watch the mists dissolve into light. The city would awaken slowly, the bells calling to prayer, the butchers opening their shutters, the scent of baking bread floating upward. He would breathe deeply then, feeling the weight of the night's mystery lift, and so life continued quietly, reverently. The people of Florence learned to live with their strange companion, this unseen air that both frightened and sustained them. They hung amulets at their throats, burned juniper in the hearths, and washed their walls with vinegar and rosewater. Whether these rituals healed or merely comforted, no one could say, but the comfort was its own medicine. Sophia, the apothecary's daughter, began to help Lorenzo in his rounds. She would bring small flasks of scented oil and rub them upon the wrists of the sick, murmuring blessings her grandmother had taught her. The patients smiled when she entered, for her presence carried calm, as if she herself were a breeze moving through the room. Lorenzo would watch her work in silence, his heart full of a quiet pride. She understood what few did, that the truest healer is not the one who cures, but the one who eases in later years, when he grew too frail to walk the city at night. Lorenzo would sit by his open window and listen to the wind. It moved through the cypress trees with a low, steady sigh. The same sound that had once filled him with dread, now filling him with peace. He would smile and whisper, "So, you have come again, my old companion. Let us breathe together." The people would still hang their herbs, still whisper of miasmas, still fear the strange fevers that visited the city from time to time. But those who remembered Lorenzo and Sophia would tell their children another truth, that the air, though unseen, could be loved, that even the wind that carried illness also carried healing, that the same breath that could bring fever could also carry the scent of jasmine at dusk. And so Florence learned to live with its invisible guest, neither banishing nor worshipping it, but listening, always listening to the soft voice of the night air. Even now, if you wander the old quarters when the city sleeps, you might feel it, a tender stirring between the stones and stars, not threatening, not cruel, only aware. The air of Florence still whispers through time, breathe slowly, fear less, rest deeply, and the Arno, ever dreaming, carries that whisper out to sea. Chapter 5. The melancholy of scholars there is a certain kind of stillness that only libraries know, a stillness woven from dust, ink, and the breath of thought itself. In the monasteries and universities of medieval Europe, that stillness was sacred. It hung between shelves of vellum manuscripts, between whispered prayers and the soft clink of ink pots, between the heartbeat and the idea. And within that silence, there grew a strange and tender ailment, melancholia. They called it the scholar's malady. It was not marked by fever or rash, but by a heaviness of the soul, a slow sadness that settled upon those who gazed too long into the mysteries of creation. It was said to come upon monks who spent their nights copying the Psalms by candlelight, upon philosophers who pondered the motions of the heavens, and upon physicians who listened too closely to the suffering of others. It came gently, like twilight creeping through a cloister window, and it lingered long. In those days, the body was understood as a harmony of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When they were balanced, a man was well. When one rose too high or fell too low, the spirit trembled. And melancholy, the dominion of the black bile, was thought to dwell in the liver and the heart, giving rise to dreams both beautiful and sorrowful. Its sufferers were not despised, but regarded with a kind of reverence. They were the quiet ones, the deep ones, the ones who felt the turning of the world too sharply. In a monastery nestled between the green hills of Flanders, an old scribe named Brother Matthias lived with this gentle affliction. He was a man of fine hands and slow words, with eyes the color of river stones. For 40 years he had served as the keeper of the abbey's library, a cool, vaulted room where beams of sunlight fell in golden columns through narrow windows. He knew each volume by touch, the roughness of calfskin bindings, the scent of oak gall ink, the faint whisper of dust when pages turned. To him, the books were not objects but companions, breathing softly through the centuries. Yet in recent years, a heaviness had crept into his heart. It began as weariness, a reluctance to greet the dawn, a fondness for the dim hours when only the candles kept him company. He told himself it was age, or perhaps the strain of his eyes. But soon it deepened into something else, a quiet ache that neither prayer nor herb could soothe. He felt the weight of the world's sorrow resting upon his shoulders, though no one had placed it there. The abbot, a kindly man named Bernard, noticed the change. One evening, as the bells tolled for vespers, he found Matthias sitting alone in the cloister garden, his quill idle, his gaze lost in the rippling of the fish pond. "Brother," said Bernard gently, "you look upon the water as though it hides the answers to your questions." Matthias smiled faintly. "It hides nothing, Father. It only mirrors what is above and below. Perhaps that is why I stare, to see whether heaven and earth have yet agreed." The abbot sat beside him, folding his hands. "You have been working too long without rest. Even the mind must be allowed its silence." "I know," Matthias murmured, "but when I close my eyes, the thoughts do not cease. They move like shadows behind the lids, and I cannot tell whether they belong to me or to something older." Bernard regarded him for a while. "You carry melancholia," he said softly. "It visits those who love truth too deeply. Do not resist it. Walk beside it. It may yet teach you gentleness." In the days that followed, Matthias tried to follow the abbot's counsel. He walked in the orchards at dawn, letting the mist cool his brow. He dipped his fingers in the stream and watched the current slide away, imagining it carrying his thoughts downstream. He breathed the scent of thyme and mint from the garden, and for a time, his heart felt lighter. But each evening, when the bells called the brothers to their desks, he returned to the scriptorium. There, the sound of quills scratching parchment filled the room like a steady rain. The air smelled of wax and ink. Shadows trembled upon the walls. And in that dim glow, the melancholy would find him again, quiet and familiar. He began to write not only the words of others, but small fragments of his own verses and reflections, written in the margins of the great texts. Where the ink darkens, he once wrote, the heart rests. For sorrow, too, seeks form. In those secret writings, he discovered that his sadness was not a curse, but a way of seeing the tender shadow that made light more precious. One afternoon, a young novice named Elias came to him. The boy had been assigned to learn the craft of lettering and illumination. His hands shook when he held the quill, his lines too heavy, his letters uncertain. Matthias watched him struggle for a while, then said gently, "The hand follows the breath. Slow your breathing, and your letters will grow calm." The novice obeyed. They sat together in silence for a long while, the scratch of the quill keeping time with the rhythm of their breaths. When the page was finished, Elias smiled with quiet pride. "Is this how you've written so many years, brother?" Breathing with the words. Matthias nodded. "It is the only way I know to pray." The boy returned to his work each day, and in his presence, Matthias felt a subtle lifting of spirit. To teach was, in its way, to heal. The melancholy softened, like mist thinning before the sun. He began to see that his ailment was not an end, but a bridge passage between solitude and understanding. In time, the abbey itself seemed to breathe with him. The brothers sang their psalms more slowly, as though savoring the silence between verses. The garden bloomed with herbs meant not only for the body, but for the mind. Lemon balm, valerian, violet. And in the evenings, when the sky turned the color of parchment, Matthias would sit by the open window of the library, listening to the wind turn the pages of books left unfinished. He thought often then of all the minds that had come before him, philosophers, poets, physicians, each touched, in their way, by melancholy. He imagined them not as tormented souls, but as deep rivers, carrying the reflections of the world upon their surface. In their sadness, he found kinship. In their stillness, comfort. The scholars of later centuries would call it acedia, the sorrow of the mind that has seen too much beauty to bear it lightly. But to Matthias, it was simpler, a quiet reminder that to feel deeply is to live fully, and that even sadness can sing softly if given patience. As autumn came, and the leaves turned gold beyond the abbey walls, Matthias felt his spirit ease. The heaviness did not leave, Emmett became a companion rather than a weight. At night, when he lay upon his narrow bed, he no longer prayed for joy, but for gentleness. And that gentleness came, not from healing, but from harmony. On his final evening, when his hands were too frail to hold the quill, he asked Elias to bring him a candle and one of the blank parchments. He dictated slowly, each word falling like a breath. "Do not fear the dark humors," he said. "They are the ink of thought. Without shadow, the page is blind. Without sadness, the soul forgets its depth. Be still. Let the melancholy teach you how to listen. When he was done, the candle flickered low, and he smiled, the faintest curve of peace upon his lips. Elias bowed his head beside him, whispering the prayer of illumination. May all who write with light. The candle guttered. Outside, the wind sighed softly through the cloister arches, carrying with it the fragrance of lavender and thyme. Chapter 6. The Waking Dreams of the Plague Doctors. There are silences that belong to peace, and there are silences that belong to waiting. In the year when the great sickness moved through the cities of Europe like a tide in fog, both kinds of silence filled the streets. Some nights were as still as prayer, others as heavy as a held breath. And in that strange hush walked the figures that people called the Doctors of Death. Though they themselves thought of their work as the study of life, they moved slowly through the lanes, wrapped in long coats of oilcloth, their faces hidden behind the long-beaked masks of their craft. The beaks were filled with herbs, lavender, mint, juniper, rose, so that the air they breathed would be sweet and safe. But the sight of them was enough to still the heart of a child at a window, or a mother holding her candle. They looked like birds of midnight, drifting through the smoke. And yet, behind those masks, most of them were not afraid. They were thoughtful men and women, watchers of the smallest signs. The color of the lips, the rhythm of a cough, the scent of the breath. They took notes in quiet script, wrapped the dying in linen, prayed softly when words still mattered, and listened to the world's pulse as it slowed. They knew the strangeness of their task, to walk among endings, and still believe in beginnings. One of them, known only in his journals as Gianni of Lucca, left behind words that read not like a record, but like a dream. He wrote by the dim light of a single candle, each sentence a breath between one life and another. The sickness moves like mist. You cannot hold it, only move with it. When I breathe through my mask, I smell mint and rosemary, and I remember that the earth itself is still kind. I walk through empty streets, and though I see death at every corner, I also see the moon. She does not turn her face away. Gianni had been a student of the new physicians of Padua, those who sought to understand the body not through fear, but through patience. He had studied the humors, the stars, the shapes of leaves, and the ways in which sorrow made the body weaker. When the plague came, he took his knowledge and his calm into the streets, moving from door to door. But what he brought most of all was stillness. He did not promise healing. He promised presence. When the dying called out, he sat beside them. When they wept, he listened. When they drifted into fever dreams, he whispered prayers not to ward off death, but to make it gentle. In the small hours before dawn, when the fires burned low and the city sighed like a sleeping creature, Gianni would walk beyond the walls to breathe. There, the air was cold and clean, and the stars seemed impossibly near. He would remove his mask and tilt his head back, letting the wind touch his skin. Sometimes he imagined the sickness was only smoke, that if one breathed deeply enough, the soul could remember how to shine through it. And in that strange hour, when the world lay between night and day, he often felt himself slipping into a kind of waking dream. He would see the faces of those he had tended, pale, peaceful, unafraid. He would see fields of white blossoms stretching endlessly, the air above them alive with the hum of unseen wings. He called these visions the breath between worlds. When morning came, he would return to the city, his steps slow, his eyes soft. He would enter a home, find the still body of someone who had gone, and gently close their eyes. Then he would open a window. "Let them leave in light," he wrote. "It is cruel to keep the soul from the morning air." In the center of the city stood the great church, where candles burned day and night. The priests spoke of punishment and redemption, of sin and cleansing. But the doctors, wrapped in their dark robes, whispered among themselves that it was not sin that had brought the sickness, but imbalanced the world out of harmony, the air too thick with sorrow. They did not see themselves as saviors, but as listeners to a great suffering that spoke through bodies and wind. Among them was a woman called Alessandra, who carried a pouch of herbs and a book of notes bound in blue leather. She wrote not of disease, but of sensations, the warmth of a fevered hand, the smell of rain after long drought, the way the birds fell silent before dawn. She said that the plague was teaching the city to be quiet again, to hear what it had forgotten to hear. At the height of the sickness, she and Gianni met often in the empty square, where a fountain still ran. They would sit upon the steps, a candle between them, and speak in low tones about what they had seen. "The people dream strange dreams before they die," she said one night. "I think the soul prepares its own comfort." Gianni nodded. "I think the sickness opens a door that has always been there. We are only learning to look at it." The moon watched them without judgment. The wind moved softly through the silent streets, and though the world was wounded, there was something luminous in its quiet. As the months passed, the plague began to fade. It did not vanish with trumpets or prayers, but slipped away as gently as it had come. The fires burned lower, the bells rang less often, the air cleared. The survivors stepped blinking into the light, and the doctors laid aside their masks. The herbs inside had long since dried, their fragrance faint but still sweet. Johnny returned to his home by the river, where the vines had grown wild along the walls. He tended his garden, wrote his thoughts, and allowed the silence to fill him. He no longer feared it. He had learned that the world, even when broken, still whispered of healing. In one of his final entries, he wrote, "I have walked through the shadow of death and found that it casts no hatred, only quiet. I have seen sickness teach the living to cherish the breath they once ignored. If the world should grow ill again, may it remember this, that love, when spoken softly, is stronger than contagion." And so the legend of the plague doctors softened over time. They ceased to be symbols of terror and became figures of quiet endurance. Children of later centuries would dress in their likeness for festivals, never knowing that beneath those masks had once breathed compassion. The beaked face that once meant death came to mean remembrance, a reminder that even in the darkest nights of history, there were those who walked calmly, lighting small lamps against the wind. And if you listen to the right kind of silence, the kind that hums just before dawn, you may still feel them near. The soft rustle of cloth, the faint sweetness of herbs, and the patient, endless breath of those who kept walking when all else had stopped. The air moves, the city dreams, and the doctors, in their long sleep, dream with it of smoke turning to light and of the living who still breathe. Chapter 7. The Royal Maladies. There are illnesses that move through kingdoms, the way dreams move through sleepers, quietly, invisibly, leaving no mark upon the body that the eye can see. Such were the maladies that haunted the royal courts of medieval Europe, the faint tremors of mind and blood that drifted beneath the golden ceilings of power. They were not the plagues of peasants, nor the fevers of the fields. They were gentler, stranger things, the ailments of candlelight, solitude, and too much silence. In the high towers and long corridors of castles, time flowed differently. The air seemed to echo with footsteps that had never stopped. Every sound lingered, the rustle of silk, the sigh of a page turning, the soft strike of a clock somewhere deep within stone. And in those long stretches of stillness, the body learned to speak in its own secret ways. It was said that kings suffered from the trembling heart, a sickness of worry and weight. Queens fell prey to the fainting malady, a softness of breath that stole the color from their cheeks. Princes were troubled by night humors, dreams that clung too long, and sleeplessness that seemed older than themselves. But beneath all these names and stories lay the same quiet truth. To live apart from the world is to feel its distance in the bones. In the year when King Aldric of Navarre ruled his small, sun-washed realm, the royal physicians kept their rooms filled with remedies for such invisible afflictions. Shelves lined with crystal bottles glowed softly with oils of lavender and thyme. Bowls of water caught the shimmer of candle flames. Parchment scrolls listed the virtues of air, rest, and gentle sound. For Aldric's court had become known not for its wars or wealth, but for its strange, serene infirmities. The king himself was not an old man, yet his hands sometimes shook when he held a quill. He spoke slowly, often pausing as if to listen to something inside himself. Those who served him said that he was burdened by the thought fever, the malady of rulers, who think too much upon the fragility of all things. When his head ached or his heart fluttered, he would retreat to his chambers and sit by the open window. watching the hills turn blue in the distance. He found comfort in the wind that moved through the curtains, cool and patient, reminding him that life, like air, could not be held. At his side was Queen Iselda, whose gentleness was the pulse of the court. She moved through the castle like a wisp of dawn, her footsteps soft, her presence calming. But she too carried her own quiet ailment, a tendency towards sudden faintness, as though her spirit sometimes forgot the weight of her body. When these spells came upon her, she would be laid upon a couch of silk near the hearth, and the court physicians would bring their small comforts, rosewater, a vial of vinegar to awaken her senses, and a lullaby played upon the lute. And always, when she opened her eyes again, she smiled faintly, as if she had been walking in a very peaceful dream. The people outside the palace walls whispered about the king and queen with affection. They called them the gentle rulers, for they governed not with iron, but with patience. Perhaps it was their frailty that taught them kindness. They understood, better than most, the tender balance of health and spirit, how easily the body could mirror the weather of the soul. Among their physicians was one named Etienne, a man of quiet manners and thoughtful eyes. He had studied in Paris and Bologna, learning the ancient arts of balance, of humors, stars, and seasons. But he had also learned something no book could teach, that healing required listening as much as knowledge. He was beloved for his calm presence. The courtiers said that when Etienne entered a room, even the candles burned more steadily. Each evening, he would walk the galleries of the castle, listening to the whispers of the servants, the cough of a guard, the slow pacing of the king in the library above. He thought of illness not as punishment, but as language, the body's way of telling its story. And so, when King Aldrich summoned him late one night, he came not with haste, but with care. The king was seated by the window, his face silvered by moonlight. Outside, the courtyard lay silent. Even the fountains seemed to hold their breath. Etienne, said the king softly, there are nights when I feel as though my heart is to men, one who rules and one who dreams. I cannot tell which is the true one, and the uncertainty tires me. The physician bowed his head. Sire, he said, perhaps they are the same man, one in daylight, one in shadow. The heart has many chambers, and all must breathe. The king smiled faintly. You speak like a monk, not a doctor. I listen like one, said Etienne. He brewed the king a draught of lemon balm and valerian, not to cure but to soothe, and asked that no lamps burn while he drank it. Darkness, he said, is sometimes the gentlest medicine. The king obeyed, and when the cup was empty, he slept. For the first time in many nights, he dreamed not of war or duty, but of an open field beneath soft rain. He woke with tears on his cheeks, not of sorrow, but of relief. Word of the physician's methods spread quietly through the court. He began to tend to others who carried the invisible ailments of power, the courtiers with trembling hands, the ladies whose sighs hid unspoken fears, the servants who could not sleep for worry of their families beyond the walls. He gave each of them the same prescription: to walk in the gardens at dawn, to breathe deeply, and to remember that their hearts belonged to the same wind that moved the banners above the towers. Queen, Isilda, found solace in his teachings. She began to spend her afternoons in the small walled garden behind her chambers, where roses grew in pale shades of ivory and blush. She would sit among them with her embroidery untouched on her lap, her eyes half closed, and listen to the hum of bees. The fainting spells came less often. When they did, they passed like soft clouds. Sometimes she and Etienne would speak as the evening bells rang. "Why does the body grow weak from peace as well as from fear?" she asked once. "Because peace, too, is a weight," he said. "We are not built to live always in stillness. The heart needs its tides." Her eyes softened. "Then let the tide take me gently," and it did. The queen grew more fragile with the years, her laughter quieter, her presence lighter, but she was content. When she walked the halls at dusk, trailing her fingers along the cool stone, those who passed her would feel calmer, as if some small part of their own worries had dissolved into her grace. When she finally fell ill in winter, not with plague or fever, but with the slow fading that sometimes visits the gentle, the king kept vigil by her side. Etienne sat nearby, writing notes by candlelight, his expression composed and reverent. Outside, snow fell upon the castle roofs, muffling all sound. The great world beyond the walls continued its turning, but within those chambers, time seemed to drift like smoke. In her final days, the queen whispered dreams. She spoke of walking through a garden that had no end, where the roses glowed softly even without sun. She said the air there was warm and forgiving, and that every sound was music. Her hand rested upon the king's, light as a feather. When at last her breathing grew still, he did not cry out. He bowed his head and kissed her brow, whispering, "Rest, my heart." Then, in the long silence that followed, he heard only the faint crackle of the fire, a sound that seemed to echo from another world. The court mourned quietly. There were no grand processions, only candles lit in every window, their flames trembling like the pulse of the kingdom itself. And in that glow, King Aldrich felt not despair, but a strange, steady calm. He continued to rule, though more softly than Chapter 8. The cures of candlelight night had fallen gently over the abbey. The rain had come and gone, leaving beads of silver trembling upon every leaf, and the world smelled of wet stone and clean earth. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, a single patient voice rising into the hush. And through that hush, the monks of St. Leora moved like shadows, carrying their lanterns down the long corridors of the infirmary in this abbey, tucked between green hills and whispering streams. The art of healing was practiced with a serenity that felt almost like prayer. The brothers did not call themselves physicians. They called themselves keepers of warmth. They believed that light and silence were medicine, that the gentle glow of a candle could soothe what herbs alone could not. Each night, before the moon reached its highest point, they entered the chamber of the sick. They did not speak. They simply placed small candles upon each bedside table, one by one, until the room shimmered with 100 trembling lights. The air filled with the scent of beeswax and thyme, a fragrance both humble and holy. And then they waited, for the monks had observed, over many years, that those who slept beside flame healed faster than those who did not. It was not a superstition, they said, but a rhythm, a quiet harmony between body and fire. The candle's flicker was a heartbeat for those whose strength had forgotten its own pace. In one bed lay a young woman named Amara, a traveler who had fallen ill upon the road. Her hands were thin, her breathing soft, as though she spoke in dreams. Brother Thomas, who tended her, watched the candle beside her pillow burn low. The flame wavered, grew strong again, then leaned toward her as if listening. He had seen such things often and did not question them. Every soul, he once wrote in his small journal, draws comfort from light. Even the faintest flame reminds us that the darkness has agreed to share the world. When Amara awoke, she found the monk reading quietly beside her. "What are you reading?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A treatise on heat," he said, smiling softly. An old physician once wrote that warmth is the gentlest of all teachers. It loosens what is bound and reminds the blood to move like song. She closed her eyes, letting that thought drift through her like breath. "I dreamed of fire," she murmured, "not burning, only shining." He nodded. "That is how healing begins." In the garden beyond the cloister, herbs grew in careful order, mint beside lemon balm, sage beside violet, rosemary standing tall like little green flames. The brothers moved among them each morning, touching the leaves with reverent hands. They spoke to the plants softly, believing that sound itself guided their strength. When they gathered the herbs, they carried them in linen cloths so that no metal would disturb their spirit. The abbey had its own small apothecary, where Brother Edric, the oldest of them, worked by candlelight from dusk until dawn. His hands were stained with oil and honey, and his beard smelled faintly of myrrh. He was known throughout the valley as the keeper of quiet remedies. People came not only for his salves and tonics, but for the peace that seemed to live in his presence. He often said that the true cure for most ills was not found in jars or cups, but in gentleness. Every sickness is a tightening, he told his students. The healer's task is simply to help the world loosen its hold. At the heart of his chamber stood a great oak table, smooth and pale from years of use. Upon it lay bowls of herbs, vials of scented oils, and small bundles of dried flowers tied with twine. Candles surrounded it on all sides, their light quivering against the stone walls. Edric never worked in darkness. He believed that every act of healing should be witnessed by light. He taught his apprentices to mix not only ingredients, but moods, to stir honey with patience, to pour water with grace, to crush petals as if blessing them. For what we touch, he said, we change, and what we change we carry within us. When a fevered traveler came to the abbey one rainy evening, shivering and pale, Brother Edric placed him near the hearth and set 4 candles around him, one at each corner of the bed. Then he sat beside him through the night, saying little, only humming softly. By dawn, the man's breathing had steadied. He opened his eyes and saw the monk still there, his hands folded, his face calm as morning stone. "Are you a doctor?" the traveler asked. "No," said Edric, "only a light keeper. But sometimes that is enough." As years passed, the fame of St. Leora's Abbey spread far and wide. Scholars came from distant lands to study the cures of candlelight, though the brothers themselves never claimed to understand them fully. They only observed what they saw, that light calmed the restless, that warmth eased the dying, that silence itself seemed to mend what words could not reach. Even when pestilence swept across the countryside, the abbey remained a place of serenity. The brothers did not flee. They lit more candles. They placed them in windows and corridors, in the infirmary and the chapel, until the night itself seemed to breathe with a soft golden glow. The sick who were brought there seldom recovered completely, but they passed peacefully, with smiles faint as candle smoke. "Perhaps," said Brother Thomas, "one evening we do not heal bodies at all. Perhaps we only remind souls how to rest." Brother Edric nodded. That may be the truest medicine. When he himself grew old and frail, his hands trembling too much to mix herbs, the younger monks tended to him with the same tenderness he had taught them. They lit a circle of candles around his bed, the air fragrant with balm. He lay watching the flames flicker and fade, and whispered, "See how the light dances, never hurried, never afraid." Let that be your lesson. After his passing, the abbey kept his room just as it was. Visitors said they could still smell honey and rosemary in the air, even years later. The candles upon his table were kept burning day and night, tended by novices who said that the flames sometimes bent toward one another as though in conversation. The monks of St. Leora believed that such light could cross thresholds, that it could travel through walls, through dreams, perhaps even through time. They imagined that somewhere beyond the veil of sleep, there was a vast field of golden fire, where all the little flames of the world gathered when they were no longer needed below. It comforted them to think that the candles they lit for the sick were never truly extinguished, only transformed in the centuries that followed. Long after the abbey stones had crumbled and the names of its brothers were forgotten, travelers still spoke of a strange glow upon the hills at night. It was not lightning, nor torchlight, nor the moon. It was softer, a shimmer like a sigh, a warmth that could be felt even in cold wind. Those who saw it said they felt their hearts slow, their breath deepen. Some claimed that if one stood very still, one could hear faint chanting, like wind moving through hollow reeds, and though no one could prove it, they whispered that the monks of St. Leora still tended their eternal lights, guiding the lost, soothing the weary, guarding the quiet art of gentle healing. So, if ever you find yourself awake in the small hours, with thoughts that will not rest, light a candle and watch it burn. Do not rush it. Let its rhythm become your own. The monks would say, that in that flicker lies a kind of conversation between body and soul, between sickness and surrender, between darkness and dawn. The flame bends, breathes, straightens again, and slowly the world grows calm. Chapter 9. The witch's garden, the forest, in early spring was full of whispers. The ground steamed faintly where the frost had lifted, and the small streams ran fast and silver between the roots. If you followed one of those streams far enough, through thickets of hazel and fern, you would come to a clearing that was neither wild nor tamed, a place where the air seemed to hum softly, even when no wind moved. There, in a garden surrounded by woven willow, lived a woman the villagers called the Witch of Hollowmere. She was not old, though her hair was streaked with silver, nor young, though her step was light. Her true name was Alara. She lived alone, save for a grey cat and the many herbs that filled her garden like a living tapestry. The villagers came to her when fevers would not break, when milk curdled too quickly, when children woke from nightmares crying. They left her bread, honey, or wool, never coin. And though the church frowned upon such dealings, even the priest kept a pouch of her dried lavender beneath his pillow. Ilara's garden was not arranged by beauty, but by friendship. She planted things that liked to grow together. Rosemary beside sage, chamomile beside mint, foxglove in the shade of the elder tree. In the center stood a small stone basin filled with rainwater and petals. It was said that on still nights she could read the health of the world in its surface, whether sickness stirred, whether harvests would be kind, whether the wind carried warning. She worked slowly, always humming under her breath, a tune so low it was more vibration than sound. The plants seemed to lean toward it. She never rushed her hands, for she believed haste frightened healing away. When she gathered herbs, she thanked each one aloud, whispering, "You have done enough, rest now." People often came to her garden, trembling, not from illness, but from the unspoken weight of worry. She would sit them by the fire, wrap them in wool, and place a sprig of thyme between their palms. "Breathe," she'd say, her voice deep and slow, "until you can smell the green." Then she would brew a simple tea and listen, not asking questions. Sometimes that was cure enough, for there were sicknesses of the Middle Ages that left no mark but could hollow. A person, all the same weariness that never lifted, dreams that clung too tightly, thoughts that circled like birds that could not land. The physicians called it vapors or melancholia. Alara called it the drifting. "Your spirit," she would tell them, "has walked too far from your bones. We must call it home." She had ways for this, soft ways. She burned small bundles of juniper, letting the smoke curl around the room. She brushed it over the patient's hair, over their chest, over their feet. Then she would touch a bowl of water to the smoke so that steam rose gently upward, carrying their worry away. When the patient's breathing slowed, she would smile. "Good," she would whisper. "Now the earth can hold you again." The villagers trusted her not because she was magical, but because she was unafraid of sorrow. When others fled from sickness, she stayed. When others prayed for the pain to end, she listened to it, and the pain, finding itself heard, often softened. One evening, near midsummer, a boy was brought to her door. He was no more than 12, his skin pale, his pulse weak. His mother said he had stopped eating and rarely spoke, only staring at the hearth as though he saw something there. Ilara laid a hand upon his brow, cool, damp. Not fever, but withdrawal, like a tide drawn too far out. She did not ask what frightened him. She only set to work. She took him first to the garden. The moon had risen, white and round, and the plants shimmered as though made of breath. She led him among them slowly, naming each one. "This is Yarrow, the warrior's friend. This is Balm, the sleeper's comfort. This is Rue, the herb that forgives." The boy said nothing, but his gaze followed her hand. When they reached the basin in the center, she knelt and touched the water. "Look," she said. The surface trembled, reflecting the moon in broken pieces. "The world is never still," she murmured. "You do not have to be either." That night, she made him a drink of warm milk, honey, and crushed violet petals. When he had finished it, she placed the cat beside him on the cot and hummed the low, wordless melody that always filled her house after dark. By morning, his color had returned. Within days, he was helping her gather herbs, and his mother wept quietly when she came to fetch him. The villagers said the boy had been cured by enchantment, but Elara only smiled. "Nothing enchanted," she said, "only remembered." As the years passed, her name spread beyond Hollowmere. Travelers sought her garden for ailments that defied the learned men's trembling hands. Sleeplessness, sorrow without cause. She treated them all the same way, with touch, with scent, with stillness. Those who stayed long enough said they began to dream differently there. The dreams were not bright or wild, but slow and kind, as if the mind itself had begun to rest. Sometimes, on nights when fog rolled low and the forest seemed made of breathing, Elara would sit by the basin and speak softly to the air. "Tell me what comes," she would say. And in the water, shapes would appear, faint ripples, glimmers of light, nothing more. But she would nod, understanding. Her cat would lift its head, ears twitching, then settle again. Whatever she saw, it never frightened her. Once, a scholar from the city came to see her. A thin man, wrapped in a heavy cloak, despite the warm evening. He had read of her in the letters of pilgrims and sought to test her craft. "I study the diseases of the mind," he said. "They say you heal them with smoke and song." "I heal nothing," she replied. "I make space for healing to happen." He frowned, uncomprehending. "Then what is your method?" She pointed to the candle between them. "Watch," she said. They sat in silence as the flame burned, steady at first, then wavering, then steady again. "Do you see how it moves?" she asked. It bends to the breath, to the air, to the smallest change. The body is the same. When it learns to bend instead of break, sickness begins to fade. He stayed 3 days, and when he left, he said nothing. But later, he wrote of her in his journal. I met a woman in the wood who knows more of peace than any physician knows of pain. The seasons turned. The garden flowered and slept again. Elara's hair turned white, her hands lined like bark, but her eyes remained bright. People still came, though she walked more slowly now, leaning on a carved staff, when she could no longer kneel among her herbs. She taught the children who visited, showing them how to touch the leaves without harm, how to listen for the hum beneath the soil. She told them stories of plants that once spoke to the stars and of roots that carried memory deeper than stone. And when at last she felt her own strength begin to ebb, she asked that no one weep. I am only going back to the garden, she said. Every healer must one day become the soil again. The night she died was warm, full of the scent of rain. The villagers found her lying beside the basin, a single candle still burning at her side. The water was calm, the reflection of the moon unbroken. They buried her at the edge of the clearing, beneath the elder tree, and left her garden untouched. No one could bring themselves to pick a single leaf, but the garden did not fade. The plants grew taller, stronger, looming at odd seasons, glowing faintly under the stars. And on certain nights, when the air was especially still, travelers passing by swore they could see a pale figure moving among the herbs, her hands brushing the leaves, her humming low and kind. They said the light of her candle still lingered. Chapter 10. The Dreaming Cure. There are nights when the world itself seems to sleep, when wind slows and the air holds its breath, and even the stars look less like fire and more like eyes closed in rest. It was on such nights that the people of old began to understand that sleep was not weakness, nor escape, but medicine, the oldest, gentlest kind, by the late Middle Ages, after centuries of fever and fear, of pilgrim roads and burning candles, of healers and kings and whispers in the dark, Europe grew tired. Its fields were quiet again. Its towns no longer trembled at the toll of every bell. And as peace settled softly over the land, so too did a new reverence. Not for war or wealth, but for rest. The physicians began to speak of the dreaming cure. It was not written in any one book, nor practiced in any one city. It emerged like dawn, slowly, everywhere at once. They observed that those who slept deeply, who dreamt kindly, who were allowed to heal through stillness, lived longer and smiled more easily. They learned that the mind and body, long divided by fear, could be reunited by slumber. Monks who once tended herbs now tended silence. They built chambers designed for calm, narrow rooms with small windows that looked upon the sky, so that the patient might gaze at light before closing their eyes. They believed that the rhythm of sleep was divine, that it mirrored the pattern of the heavens, the rise and fall of breath echoing the tides of creation in the quiet town of Lucca. An apothecary named Beatrice began to keep a journal of dreams. She had once studied the potions of the plague years, vinegar waters, burnt herbs, oils of rose and camphor, but she found that nothing soothed the sick as well as gentle rest. So she changed her practice. She called herself not a healer, but a watcher of dreams. Her little shop smelled of wax and chamomile. At night, she left the shutters open to let moonlight spill upon the shelves. Each morning, she recorded what her patients had dreamt: a child seeing doves in the sky, a soldier hearing his mother's lullaby, an old woman walking through fields of golden light. Beatrice noted how their ailments shifted after each dream. A fever cooled, a cough eased, a sadness lifted. She wrote, "Sleep is the earth's own medicine. The body closes its eyes so that the soul may see what must be seen to mend." Her neighbors began to call her the dreaming doctor. Even the priests approved, for she spoke not of magic, but of peace. When people came to her in anguish, she would make them a tea of violet, warm milk, and a single drop of honey. Then she would guide them to a small room filled with soft light and say, "Here, forget the world for a while. The world will remember you when you wake." And so she watched over them, these weary souls who came seeking sleep. Some stayed hours, some days. When they woke, she greeted them with bread and calm conversation. Many wept, not from sorrow, but from the quiet they had found at last. Across the sea in England, others came to the same wisdom. In monastic infirmaries, the brothers began to speak of curasomni, the cure of sleep. They built great feather beds for the sick, warmed bricks by the fire to place at their feet, and let music drift faintly from the chapel as they rested. It was said that a single week in those beds could do more than a month of tonics. One old chronicler, Brother William of Glastonbury, wrote, "I have seen with my eyes that peace lengthens the breath, and stillness binds the soul to the flesh again. For every hour that man sleeps in faith, the world heals a little more." In time, sleep became sacred. The church bells that once rang to warn of plague now tolled softly at twilight, reminding the people to close their doors, bank their fires, and lie down beneath the gaze of heaven. Parents told their children that angels walked the roads only at night, listening for those who breathed steadily, guarding them until morning. Even the kings learned. In the cold castles of the north, the physicians replaced iron draughts with softer cures. They placed bowls of lavender beside royal pillows, opened the windows to the night, and let the moonlight spill upon the silks. Queens who had fainted from worry now slept deeply, and kings who had trembled with thought now woke calm. They called it the silver blessing. But beyond all these grand chambers and written words, the truest dreaming cure still lived in the hearts of ordinary folk. In cottages by the fields, women hummed old songs as they blew out candles. Men laid aside their tools and sat quietly, feeling their pulse slow. Children listened to the soft murmur of their elders, telling stories of healers. Plagues and miracles that ended not with trumpets, but with silence. They came to understand that all the strange diseases that haunted their ancestors, the fevers, the dance frenzies, the trembling hearts, had been the body's way of crying out for stillness. The world too had been ill with motion and fear, and now, at last, it rested. The land itself seemed to breathe again. Rivers cleared, the air softened, the sound of birds at dawn returned to the villagers. It was as though the earth had followed the people into sleep and awoken healed beside them in her old age. Beatrice, the dreaming doctor, wrote one last entry in her journal before laying down her quill. When the plagues came, we learned fear. When they passed, we learned quiet. Now we learn sleep. Let it be known to those who come after, the body mends by moonlight, and the soul listens best when the world grows still. She blew out her candle, lay down upon her cot, and slept. Her apprentices found her the next morning, her face serene, her lips curved faintly, as if she were dreaming of sunlight through leaves. They did not weep. They opened the shutters to let the light in and whispered the blessing she had taught them. May her dreams continue. And so the story of strange diseases, whispered for centuries in fear, became instead a lullaby of healing. The ailments that once haunted the heart of Europe faded into memory, their lessons woven into the rhythm of night and day. The monks' candles, the plague doctor's masks, the healer's gardens, all were threads in the same gentle tapestry, teaching humanity how to rest again in time. The people forgot the names of the illnesses, but they remembered the feeling of peace that followed. They remembered how it felt to breathe slowly beside a quiet fire, to hear rain upon the roof, to trust that the dawn would come. That was the true cure, not in potions or prayers, but in the deep surrender of rest. And perhaps that cure remains. Perhaps every night, when we close our eyes and the noise of the day fades to a hum, we return to those old abbeys, those gardens, those moonlit rooms of long ago. Perhaps we, too, are part of the same long sleep, the same endless mending of hearts and bodies that began in the medieval dark and never truly ended. So now, as you listen to this final silence, let it hold you. Let the centuries fall away. There is only the breath of the world, the steady pulse beneath your ribs, the faint memory of candles burning somewhere far away. The air is gentle, the night forgiving, the dream already here, and in that dream all is well, all is well, all is well.